Right, this is probably going to be quite a short video on just the most important rules of opposite colour bishop endings as given by Dvoretsky in his endgame manual, which he illustrates with this very simple example. So you can pause the video at any time and try and work out what would you do here as white. But you can see on the screen there that covering up a sort of a camera of me, which far more useful obviously, is a list of sort of general principles for opposite coloured bishop endings. And I'm just going to read out what Dvoretsky says in his manual, because I think it's useful, and you probably know a lot of them already. I mean, I certainly did, but it's just good to remind ourselves of them, and nice to see a position in which they kind of all apply at once. So we've got drawing tendencies. So he writes that here it is frequently possible to save oneself even 2 or 3 pawns down. The consequences of this rule are obvious. The stronger side must be exceptionally alert, whether going into a pure opposite colour bishop's ending or playing one out. Here it's easy to stumble into drawing counterchance. And for the weaker side, going into the opposite colour bishop's ending is sometimes the key to salvation, sharply increasing the chances for a favourable outcome. This is especially true when there are rooks or queens and the stronger side can generate an attack on the king. In general, the drawing tendencies only apply to pure opposite colour bishop endings and not to positions with more pieces on the board. I can testify to that on a personal level. I had a game at the Hull Congress last year against a very strong rated player, one of the top 100 in the UK. And he sort of strangely swapped rooks at a time when I kind of really wanted him to. And then I just played the opposite colour bishop's ending. It was fairly simple actually, but I played it pretty well, and it was a draw pretty soon after that. And then at the British Championships in Liverpool this year, in my round 8 match, I was playing a slightly higher graded player and defended an opposite colour bishop's ending where there were queens, just queens actually, queens and bishops on the board. And I defended it very well and got down to the point where my opponent offered me a draw. And at that point, I decided that I had the initiative and carried on. I said, I'll play on for a bit. And before you knew it, I played myself into a hopeless situation. And the queen still being on the board, I'd basically completely screwed it up and just had to resign. That was a very, very painful loss and hopefully part of a sharp learning curve. So yeah, when the queens and the rooks are on opposite coloured bishops, doesn't necessarily mean draw. I mean, I knew that already, but it didn't stop me sort of going against that rule, as it were. The fortress. So he writes here, the main theme of opposite coloured bishops' endings is that of the fortress. The weaker side strives to create one, the stronger side strives to prevent its formation, or if it already exists, a way to break through it. An important factor in endgame play is the ability to analyse a position logically, to think through various plans and schemes. Logical thinking is of special importance in endings with opposite coloured bishops. In the majority of cases, such endings are not played as much as they are constructed. That tallies for me as well with what is it Shereshevsky in Endgame Strategy talks about. In endgames we should be thinking in schematic ways. First, it is necessary to determine the configuration of pawns and pieces which will render the position impenetrable. Only then we proceed with the calculation of variations which will prove whether or not we can attain the desired configuration and whether it is in fact impenetrable. The following rules show the most important techniques for setting up and breaking down fortresses. So pawn placement. He says we will discuss the principle that requires us to place our pawns on the opposite colour squares from that controlled by our bishop. So usually that's what we do. In opposite colour bishop endings, the principle only holds true for the stronger side. It's especially important with connected passed pawns. But the weaker side must, contrary to the general rule, keep his pawns on the same colour squares as his own bishop. In that event, he will usually be able to defend them. In fact, a pawn defended by its bishop can only be attacked by the enemy king, which renders it invulnerable. In other types of endgames, such a pawn could be attacked not just by the king, but by other pieces, such as a knight or a bishop of the same colour. Then positional nuances are worth more than material. When we're playing an opposite coloured bishop's ending, the number of pawns on the board frequently has less significance than the small alteration in the placement of pieces or pawns, even an apparently insignificant one. Therefore, in opposite coloured bishop endgames, we quite frequently encounter positional pawn sacrifices. The one diagonal principle. For both the stronger and the weaker side, it is very important that the bishop should defend its own and stop the enemy pawns without tearing, that is, along one and the same diagonal. So you might be looking at this position and hopefully trying to start thinking in schemes already, like, can we think ahead? What is the impenetrable fortress? Is there a one diagonal? White's clearly defending this. Is there a one diagonal that this bishop belongs on that black's just not going to break through? And then pawns in the crosshairs. This is basically where if you're the defending side, you should attack your opponent's pawns as much as possible. You should do that anyway, even if it's like bishop versus pawns. I'm going to do a video on the tail hook, which is just two connected passed pawns against a bishop. And that game I played at Hull against a much stronger player and managed to draw. I had pawns in the crosshairs in my head and employed it very well. So a typical means of defence is for the bishop to attack the enemy pawns. This will either force their advance to the less favourable squares of the colour of their own bishop, or tie the enemy king to its pawn's defence. In opposite coloured bishop endgames, both techniques are used frequently. So those are all the sort of the general rules of opposite coloured bishop endings, and they were worth remembering. And yeah, what are we going to do here? Well, the thinking schematically, the thinking ahead, is that we want to attack this pawn to force it to move. If we're going to attack it before the black king has time to defend it, it does have to move. And then this diagonal is going to be, it's going to be a one diagonal principle. You imagine the bishop being on that diagonal. If this pawn here has moved forward to e5, and our king's sitting sort of happily on e4, that's a fortress. The only problem is that we have no way to attack it before the black king comes and defends it, unless we're sort of materially minded. Whilst we're materially minded, that's what's going on. And the fact that this is a sort of almost like a puzzle, white to play in a book, white to play and draw that's a puzzle in a book, means that the move's just screaming out on us, especially in light of the how is it phrased again? Positional nuances are worth more than material. This pawn's just absolutely useless to us, and it's getting in our way. We need to get at the e6 pawn, because if we can get at that e6 pawn before the black king's got time to defend it, it's done. And so the move's pretty obvious. We play c5, exclamation mark. Does he give it a double exclamation mark? No, just a single. So it's a pretty good move. Bishop takes, and there it is. Attack that e6 pawn. It moves. Bishop comes to e6. The black king comes in, but our king sits on e4. And Dvoretsky writes that the draw is obvious. All white needs to do is move the bishop back and forth along this diagonal. The principle of one diagonal. We're defending our pawn on h3. There's just absolutely nothing that black can do there. Thus, white was able to save himself 3 pawns down. So that's the drawing tendency demonstrated. The final position is a fortress, in which the weaker side's only pawn is properly placed on the same colour as its own bishop. The bishop defends its pawn at h3 and holds the enemy pawns at g5 and f6 on the same diagonal. So white sacrificed a pawn. So I just lost my place in the book. So white sacrificed a pawn so that by attacking the enemy's sole well-placed pawn at e6, he could force it to advance to a dark square, after which the pawns could be easily blockaded. So yeah, that's a pretty simple position, and demonstrating hopefully all those rules on the right hand side, which are good rules that we can all bear in mind when we're doing opposite coloured bishops more generally. Hope everyone finds that useful.